During the night between April 20th and 21st in 1979, Core Air flight CR 152 from Brazil to Panama crash lands somewhere in the Amazon rainforest. Only a handful of the passengers and the crew survive. The radio is broken. They don't know where they are. No one outside the crash site knows where they are. The crash site is not visible from air, from the above. Help is not on its way, and the food will only last maximum of 2 weeks. Now that's a classic starting point for a classic survival story. Through the hardship and impossible odds rises a hero, pushing past the limits of ordinary people and saving everybody else in the progress. But this is not that story. You see, those still alive are just regular people, and none of them have any skills to help them survive the jungle after the food runs out. There really are no heroes among them. Some businessmen, a university professor, a steward, an ancient movie star, a Banana Republic general, a 12-year-old boy and his nanny. From this group, all kinds of ideas for survival arise, all desperate and unlikely to work. But they decide that if death comes, they'd rather die trying. Well, most of them anyway. These thin slivers of hope gives them a sense of purpose. It unites them as they set themselves a very tight schedule and start preparing. But they keep dying at alarming rate. I'm not revealing too much if I say that many of the characters will die before the last page. And death comes in many forms. Fear, desperation, grief, bad plans, bad luck, stupidity, cowardice, violence. The jungle is unforgiving, while some are openly happy that others die, as that leaves more food for the rest. And the clock keeps ticking. Hello and welcome back to Analog Comics. Today I'm going to talk to you about a comic book, well actually 2 comic books that are worth at least knowing in case you don't want to read them. There's a story to these comic books, not just the story within the comic books, but the story about these comic books. And it ties in quite closely to the history of bande dessinée. In fact, so much that for a while I thought about including this video to my Do You Know European Comics video series. Those videos are easily found from my channels because the thumbnails have a specific blue background. And also this story is very personal for myself. I'm talking about these 2 comics. A Story Without a Hero and 20 Years Later. Let's start with The Story Without a Hero. It's a one-off comic written by Jean van Hamme and drawn by Dany, a pen name for Daniel Androtine. Both of these creators are from Belgium, and for both of these creators this was a beginning of sorts. This story was serialized in the Tintin magazine starting in '75, and it was collected into album format in 1977. And this is the original cover art, and my copy is a Finnish translation. Before this story, the artist, Dany, had already published other works, but they were completely different style, more cartoony. So this was his first take on more realistic style. Now I believe I'm not wrong if I say that the Dany name is mostly unknown to readers outside Europe. And as far as I understand, his biggest success came from the more cartoony style comics. Now Jean van Hamme, that name is completely another story today. He is one of the most successful writers in Europe ever. But when he wrote this comic, he was mostly an unknown name. He was actually still working in marketing and doing the writing just on the side. And despite his monumental success, the story without a hero has slowly faded and been buried under the dust of time. It's actually a fact that he often jokes about in his interviews and even in his other works. But I have heard that this has become some kind of a cult classic in France, and it has been kept in print. Now, if there's anyone watching this from that market, I'd like to know if this is true and how you see the story without a hero. In Finland, this is easy to find from the second-hand bookstores. You can get it with 2 to 3 euros. But all of you reading comics in English, there's good news. This is available in English through Cinebook, one of my favorite publishers. However, their version is smaller. It's this size, the same size as the 20 years later. The thing is that when Cinebook started translating the French comics into English, they started with a smaller format. Later, they moved to the real European album size in their publishing. However, they did not update those albums that started out smaller. So they still keep printing them in a little bit smaller format. Cinebook English version has a different cover. It's based on one of the panels inside the story. And it belongs to their Espresso line, which means that the story is concluded in 1 or 2 albums. I read this comic first time when I was a child, and I think I might have been a bit too young to read it. There's a 12-year-old boy in this story, and he has to make decision that no 12-year-old boy should have to make. And me being the same kind of age made a really big impact on me, and I thought about it often. But this also became one of my favorite comic books. Maybe it was because of that tension and thrill I felt back then. I have studied every panel in detail. However, despite all the gruesome stuff that happens inside, what still hits me the most is the first panel and the last panel. And that is actually a very good jumping point into the story itself. I think the premise of the book is already good. Survivors of a plane crash lost in the jungle. For me, this book is about the story, not the people in it. And Dany, with his art, he manages to create the jungle as a claustrophobic, distant and scary place. It's just waiting for you to make that one error, one slip, and your life is over. And if I were to ask what is the best panel or most important panel for me in all the comics, the first panel of this book might be it, depending on the day. It's something that takes me every time I see it, when I open the first page. Through this panel, I step into that jungle and under that canopy of woods. It's like a place hidden from the rest of the world, and it's just waiting for you to fall through that, and it will swallow and hide you forever. Also, the last panel of the book, it reaches the same kind of emotional tie with me, and I'm not going to show you that. It was an ending that was unlike anything I had seen back then. I didn't see it coming. And it haunted me for over 20 years. But I also have to say that as a child, I thought that this story was true. Because of the text in the last panel, there's a text box. And because of the unnecessary info it included, that to my child brain, it felt very official, like this really happened. Looking at it now, I can see how young and naive I had been, but still that was the immersion, that extra bit that really took me in. Looking back now and knowing the heights that Sean van Hamme reads as a writer, I can already see his signature styles bubbling under here. He tells stories no one else would, and he just makes them work. And it's also those little unnecessary details that actually become necessary, because that kind of adds that, sprinkles that little extra layer of realness on top of a totally made up story. Sean van Hamme is known for his wordiness. I mean, the first comic he read was Blake and Mortimer, which is the ultimate wordiness comic ever. And I don't know if it was that or if it's just something that comes naturally for him, but he is a very, very wordy writer. However, this comic doesn't have a lot of that. And who other would have the guts to write one of his first stories so that it's trying to avoid you for caring about these characters. There really is no character you want to root for. None of the characters really stand out as a hero. Sean van Hamme doesn't even try to create emotional ties between you, the reader, and these characters. Yes, there are some characters that are more likable and some that are, well, easy to dislike. But still, they all stay quite superficial on purpose. And as a reader, you're only getting some snippets, some bits here and there, some conversations, some moments that are important to the story. But the people in those situations don't really build up into anything. And as the page count is only 48, to be able to build something more, like more flesh to the bones to the characters, you would have to have more pages, obviously. In my opinion, and I'm very biased with this, in my opinion, that would turn this story something that it shouldn't be. And despite being this short, it's still full of really hard incidents, many different ones. And despite being this short, Sean van Hamme uses 2 full spreads for one scene. It's about the sword straw. The survivors have to arrange a draw. Now, and if you think what that could be in a jungle where they don't know where they are, no one knows where they are, and the food is running out. Now, I will not tell you what that is, but I will tell you that what you are thinking is probably wrong. And the loser of that draw will get a fate that is worse than death. For me, Sean van Hamme has always had a good sense of tempo. He just instinctively knows when to pull the next rabbit out of the hat. Story Without a Hero was meant to be a one-off album. And in my opinion, I didn't feel that there was any story to tell, more story to tell once the album ended. Although that ending haunted me for so many years. After this album, both of the creators kept doing their work. They even worked together in a series called Arlequin. And as I mentioned, Dany became successful in other kind of comics too. And Sean van Hamme developed into this superstar he is today, selling over 1 million copies a year in French alone. And during that progress, he quit all his other work and focused solely on writing comics. And then suddenly, in 1997, A Story Without a Hero got a sequel. And it was aptly named 20 Years Later. And there really was 20 years between the publication of The Story Without a Hero and the 20 years later. And during those 2 decades, both of the creators had grown in fame and talent. Sean van Hamme had already started 3 of his most successful comic book series, namely Thorgal. This series had already 22 albums out, and 13 was on its 11th album, and even Largo Winch was on its 7th album. And it's quite unusual for a creator pair to come back to continue a story that was meant to be a one-off, and it happened 20 years ago. The trick with 20 years later is that the story happens 20 years later. So the time within that comic book world has moved on in real time, 20 years. So that plane crash in that rainforest is already a 20-year-old news. And certain alarming events led to an expedition that tries to find the wreckage of that plane that fell to that jungle 20 years before. And now by saying this, I'm not revealing anything important to you. Just trust me on this. And it's interesting to see how those 20 years have molded both of the creators. Dany, the artist, for example, his history and success with those more cartoony styled comics, for my eye, that kind of comes through in this one. I think that the characters are a bit more cartoony, and so is everything, although he is aiming to be realistic, just like in the first part. But I can see it somewhere, like in female characters. I can see that cartoony side of him kind of slipping through a bit. And since I have studied the panels of that first book so meticulously, I'm very biased. I mean, that is the perfect way to do it, and this is a bit different. But I'm sure that many people reading it today might be completely thinking the other way. But I think the biggest change comes in the writing, the story itself. And the story is completely different from the other one. In fact, I don't remember any sequel that would be so different from the first part. Like there's, like the way they are built. This is more like a murder mystery. There's intrigue and spy thriller and all kind of different elements that they were non-existent in the first story. But there's more, and this is important info if you are a fan of Largo Winch, this storyline, and especially if you are a completionist. You see, the story without the hero, that world is now officially part of Largo Winch world. Or should I say that Largo Winch is now officially part of Story Without a Hero, because that was published years before any of the Largo Winch comics came out. And the way these two worlds got tied in was that before the release of 20 years later, the sequel, Jan van Hamme released a text as a teaser. And in that text, Largo Winch, the character in one of his most successful series, he tells this A Story Without a Hero story to Jan van Hamme. And that story, I think, is now included if you buy the Cinebook version of The Story Without a Hero. So at the end of that book, there is that teaser text. If you own that Cinebook album, I'd like to know if this is true. I just heard that they've done it. I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention A Story Without a Hero. Partly because it's so important to me personally. And I still get those goosebumps when I see those first and the last panel. They just imprinted on me. And it's partly because it's one of the first stories published by Jan van Hamme that is available in English. And of course, one of the reasons was that odd 20-year gap between those stories that are so different from each other, but they are still connected through time within the story. And now that storyline is connected to one of Jan van Hamme's biggest success stories, the Largo Winch series. So there's a lot happening around the books themselves, but also within the story. And one of the reasons I do this is that I would love to know if there are anyone watching this who has read both of these stories. And I'd like to know how much time there was between those stories when you read them. Because it must change the whole thing when you can read them, like in one go. The only way you could simulate my experience is to read the first part now, and then wait 20 years, and then read the sequel. Well, I guess that's even not exactly like my experience, because I got to read it as a child. Also a little too young to read it, I guess. I'm wondering just how this time gap, the real time gap between the stories, affected my experience with them, and how different it must be for those who see it on the Cinebook side in their espresso line. Oh, there's two books, this is a one story, I'll order both of these and then see what I like about it. If you got interested, I would suggest that you just order the first part and then see if you want to know more. Maybe you don't like the comic book at all, but at least you know that strange story behind it. And sometimes these stories make the product itself more meaningful. Some comics are only products of their time. Despite the possible success, it might be that the content doesn't age well. Now, that can mean many things, but nevertheless, the outcome is that this particular comic will be in the end forgotten, and it will be gathering dust in the shelves of the second-hand bookstores. This is nothing new or a bad thing, just like in any art form, and comics is an art form. Not everything made can be a masterpiece. maybe not even a decent quality. Many forgotten comics, well, I wouldn't like to say they deserve that, but let's just say that they had it coming. Then there are comics that are forgotten, but shouldn't. These days, the reason for a good comic to be sidetracked from the reader's mind is insufficient online exposure. With so many comics being published these days, it's really hard for one comic to get its head above the noise. And it becomes even harder if the comic is already old. If it was published before internet and it didn't garner any big exposure even back then, despite its potential. And it becomes even harder if that comic is from Europe, as the US comics and manga are getting now the most attention of the readers, at least in YouTube. But I guess that's why you are here. And this is all I have to say this time. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.